everyone, welcome to the Movie Session Show. My name is Fariva, and happy Hunger Games week. We're just about a few days away from the prequel movies release, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and I'm super stoked to see it in theaters. Now, of course, if you've been following my channel for a while now, you know that I've done a reaction video for the first two trailers. I've actually done a real case of doing a trailer breakdown, because when it comes to the Hunger Games franchise in general, I have quite a whole history behind it. My childhood's pretty massive, and let's just say that I've not only read the prequel book, I've read all the original books before the actual movies came out, and I've watched all the movies, and I cannot even tell you just my story when it comes to the Hunger Games. I mean, I literally grew up with this. This was a big part of my childhood. I remember going to see these movies, or at least the original 4 movies, on the first day, and now 8 years later, I get to see another Hunger Games movie in theaters, and I'm super stoked to see it. We're finally getting down to the final countdown. I mean, I've been covering this for about a couple of months now, and now we're finally getting down to the end of the ride. So yeah, I'm super excited to be seeing Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I'm seeing it this Thursday on its not the first showing, of course, but Thursday night for sure. And yeah, I think what better way to commemorate the Hunger Games than to really talk about the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. And so this is why I'm making this video. There's going to be 3 things I do want to talk about, and that is, the first thing, of course, is going to be my expectations as well as my questions, things I'll be keeping an eye on when I do get to see this film that I'm going to be assessing from the beginning to the end. So things I want to discuss about that. The second I want to talk about, of course, is box office. I think that's a big one to really kind of talk about and, take into, perspective where this film is going to be, whether or not it has a chance of becoming a success or not. So I want to dive a little bit on those numbers. And then lastly, I want to talk about the first reviews, just read some of them, what they've kind of given the impression about. At least with this one, of course, like the actual embargo had lifted a while ago. It actually lifted, I believe, last Wednesday or Thursday. So very good sign. That's a very good sign in general, that whenever embargo actually lifts long before the actual release, that's a really good sign for a film that's going to be at least pretty decent. And so we do have a round of meaning scores, so we'll talk about that at the very end. But yeah, without further ado, let's get right down and jump into my assessment for the Hunger Games, and let's just discuss a little bit of it. So first thing, of course, I want to start off with is just my expectations for this film. So that'll be the questions and concerns and all that sort of stuff. So the first question I have, of course, is how much of the book will be able to adapt to the movie. Now, this is going to be, very interesting thing, because a lot of how I expect this film to be made out and how it's going to be, visualized and, edited, it's going to be very similar to how, it was made up with the original Hunger Games movies. So now let's look into the actual book itself, right? I think the book is a really best way to kind of address a lot of these questions. Now, when it comes to the original Hunger Games movies and as well as its books, right? The trilogy itself with the books it's actually a first-person perspective book. So much of the events that we see or read through the text of the Hunger Games, both like from the first, second, and third book, they're all coming from Katniss Everdeen's perspective. So everything that we see is coming from her, viewpoint, what she's seeing through her lenses, her perspective of things, the rumors that she's heard. That's coming all from her perspective. And yet in the actual movies, right, it's not just coming exclusively from Katniss's, viewpoint, right? We see sequences here and there where we get to see the scope beyond Katniss, how we actually get to see other characters and what they're doing, what they're dealing with. It's a bit more of that third perspective, right? So I would expect that, there's going to be a bit more creativity and, creative liberties in trying to expand on the storytelling. I think a good example of this would be the one scene, I believe, in the first movie where we see President Snow and he is tending to his garden and, clipping off his roses and talking to Seneca Crane. That's not in the book. That's nowhere near the book. There's nothing of that mentioned in the book. That's clearly all original content right there. And again, this makes a lot more sense where they're trying to expand the scope and the storytelling of other characters, especially in the case, President Snow is a very big character. He is going to be the foil to Katniss Everdeen. So it makes a lot more sense why they're trying to add a bit more of these sequences to expand on some of the other characters and trying to get a little sense of how they are as, and personality wise. So having said that, with the first books, right, and the first movies, I expected a little bit of a similar, trajectory and approach to how we would see with the prequel movie itself. Now, with the actual prequel book, it's very similar in structure to what we see or what we read in the text of the actual Hunger Games trilogy. In the prequel itself, it is a first-person perspective book, but it's coming from the lens of Coriolanus Snow. Now, of course, it's President Snow, who we eventually know as President Snow. But in this one, it's coming from the perspective of very young Coriolanus Snow, someone who's very, very youthful, someone who hasn't really got an idea of how the world works. He's still learning the ways. He's still a student, right? So that's where we're going to be seeing a lot more of his perspective in the context of the book. We see what he's, viewing in his own side of things. So again, a lot of the, his feelings about the war is going to be kind of, it will get a little bit of that sense throughout in the book. I would get the sense of that in the movie as well. But even that being the case, right, even though it is a first perspective book, right, because again, a lot of the book itself was, showing the lens of what he's seeing from, the actual games and what he's seeing with Lucy and his interaction with Lucy, all coming from his side. Now with the movies, I will assume there's going to be some similar liberties with that, where we're going to see, character's perspective beyond Coriolanus. We're probably going to see a bit more of Sejanus' plan. We're going to see a little bit more of Lucy and how she's trying to survive the games, which is very evident that there's going to be a lot of this, creative spin and originality from the trailers itself. Like, I think the trailers have already hinted that there's going to be a little bit more of that original, sequences and storytelling that the books itself have never really tackled on. Like, there were a couple of sequences here and there where we see Lucy running the tunnels, trying to escape from the tributes. Those are some very, unique details that were not, as detailed in the actual book or the actual prequel itself, because again, it's coming from, Snow's perspective, but we get to see a little bit of how Lucy's feeling in those moments. So those are things I'm going to expect are going to be some of the changes, which again are very expected, because when it comes to, just about any movie adaptations, right? Movie adaptations are not always 100% copycats of the original source. There's going to be some changes here and there just to see, again, a lot of it's because of the fact that things work a lot better, by taking certain turns in a movie format compared to the book format. But in this case, of course, like adding a bit more of that scope of how people are dealing with in the actual moment, it's going to be a bit more vast, a bit more beyond than just one character. So already what I already know is going to happen, I'm just really, curious about how much of the changes they're going to make. I think having seen the trailers so far, it's been pretty spot on in, trying to tackle the main, plots and main storylines from the book itself. So not expecting too much of those changes, but I can see where some of the details, like, again, the perspectives, the characters, some, little bitty pieces are probably going to be changed a little bit just to kind of elevate it in a more movie format. So that's one thing I have a question about. The second question I have is a bit more of a bigger one, and that is, will the ending change? Now, I'm going to try and keep this spoiler-free as possible, because I know there's a lot of people who have not read the books and they actually want to see this movie for themselves and, see what actually transpires. So I'm going to try and keep this spoiler-free. But one thing I will say is that the book itself is very ambiguous. It has a very ambiguous ending for one character. Now, I'm not talking about Snow. I think it's pretty given it's not Snow, because we know what happens to Snow. We've seen the Hunger Games movies. We've read the books. We know what happens to Snow. He eventually becomes a president. He eventually, rises to the occasion, and then he eventually meets his downfall, right? And the prequel is very focused on his rise. So, that's pretty clear. We already know what's going to happen there. I think the bigger case is going to be with what happens to Lucy Grey-Baird. Again, I'm not going to dive too much into it. Her actual fate is not very certain per se, I will say that. But that's why I asked this question, because I wonder whether or not Francis Lawrence, or in the case of even with the writers, if they take a bit more of a definitive approach to what happens to Lucy at the end. Because again, we only hear rumors, we only hear what people are saying, we only hear speculations from characters in the actual book, or specifically from Snow and what he's been hearing in the rumor limb. But at least in this movie, I wonder if they're going to address it a little bit more, there's going to be a bit more of this clarity about what happened to her. So that's going to be a big question right there. Are they going to make this really vast, change in the ending, and whether or not it was intended, or if they really wanted to give that definitive ending? So that's the second one I'm really looking forward to seeing, and I'm very curious if there's going to be a big change for that. The third question, of course, is, will the movie be able to handle the book's lengthiness? Now, this is a big one to really address for a couple reasons. One, the prequel book is the longest book in the Hunger Games series. Like, without a doubt, there's no competition about it. Because the original Hunger Games books, right? I think the shortest was maybe about 371, and I think the longest was maybe 390. So it was around this 380, average length of pages when it comes to the actual book series. So they were not too long. But this one, the prequel itself, is 517 pages. I mean, it's extremely long. There's a reason for why it's long. There's a lot of stories, a lot of plots to really kind of delve into. So yeah, so it makes a lot more sense why this book is so very lengthy. And that's why I wanted to raise this concern about, the lengthiness of the movie. Because now, at least when it comes to the length of the movie so far, we know for a fact that the movie is 2 hours and 38 minutes long. This makes it the longest Hunger Games movies by far. I think the original longest movies were the first two films. They both, I think, had about 2 hours and like 26 minutes. So even with that, right, there's a 12-minute gap between Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and the previous, long movies that we've had before. But even with that being the case, right, I feel like 12 minutes, like an extra 12 minutes may not be enough. Because again, the actual prequel book is very long. There's a lot of things that this movie really delves into. There's a beginning sequence where we learn the characters, meet the characters, and see the dynamic between Coriolanus and Lucy. The second act is very focused on the 10th Hunger Games. And the third act is very focused on the things that happen after the 10th Hunger Games. And I'll address a little bit of that in a second, but it's a very lengthy book. There's a lot of content to really kind of tackle that the movie itself would have to really kind of, somehow try to structure itself. And so that's one of the reasons why I want to address this, like how will it emulate or trying to translate the lengthiness of the book onto the movie and whether or not it would really pay off. So that's a big question right there that I have in terms of the book length and how it can really be able to kind of, again, translate to the movie. So that's the third question I have. Now, having addressed my big questions right there, I do have some expectations. So the first thing I have in terms of my expectation is that I have a pretty good feeling that the best bit of the movie is going to come from the second act. And there's a reason why. So as I said before, I kind of broke down how the acts work out. The second act is the 10th Hunger Games. This is where we get down to the violent parts of the Hunger Games, the suspense, the twist. I will even say this, like in terms of the actual content from the 10th Hunger Games, I feel like a lot of the violence and the suspense and the twists and turns is pretty much on level with how I felt about Catching Fire. Now, for me, Catching Fire is my favorite Hunger Games book, without a doubt. There's a reason why. I mean, the stakes are higher. I mean, it's very violent. It's a lot more strategic. There's a lot more at stake. Again, they're dealing with, at least with the 75th Hunger Games, they're not dealing with just any sort of tributes. They're dealing with previous Hunger Game victors who have a lot of experience when it comes to the game. So a very tough one in the 75th Hunger Games where like everyone has a lot of experience having been a previous victor before. So, Catching Fire, great stuff. The actual prequel has a very good sequence when it comes to 10th Hunger Games. Yeah, even though this is one of the earlier games, of course, once you get to learn a little bit of how the Hunger Games worked around the earlier times, it makes a lot more sense why this 10th Hunger Games is very significant. And so I think because of that, again, this 10th Hunger Games had a lot of big twists and turns that you will see if you have not read the books, you'll see the bits and pieces. But I think for a fact that because of how they really arrange a lot of those bits and sequences for the 10th Hunger Games and how it's, very, it has a lot of this high stakes involved in it, that it makes a really entertaining, very, mesmerizing, very tantalizing Hunger Games right there. So again, I think the second act is going to be some of the best content we're going to get from this movie. Just to there's a lot of things that happen. Again, there's going to be a lot of action, without a doubt, if you're someone who loves these action sequences. So, or if you're really into the action. So, that's my, expectations for that. Now, with the second act being the one I feel like is going to be the best bit, I think the one I'm most concerned about is going to be the third act. And there's a big reason why. As I said before, the third act is basically the aftermath of the 10th Hunger Games. And it's a very lengthy, part that we have to go through. And so let me explain my experience having now, again, I've read the books. I know how, what happens and all that sort of stuff. And here's what my experience was like reading this book. I enjoyed the first and second half of this book. The first half really goes into a lot of the details of the characters, the personalities, the dynamic between Coriolanus and Lucy, and how they really start to evolve in terms of the relationship and how that leads up to the 10th Hunger Games, right? So that's that one bit. Really interesting stuff. You kind of get really gripped into the actual narrative and storytelling right there. Then you have the second Hunger Games, of course, where I just mentioned that it's going to be probably the best bit, where you have all the violence, the expectations of what's going to happen, the twists and turns, all that sort of stuff, right? The more you're reading the actual context of the second Hunger Games, you're having this adrenaline rush of like, oh my God, this is like really starting to get really intense. Like, it's some really intense stuff in the context of the 10th Hunger Games. So you're going through all that rush, you're going through all this anxiety, going through all the suspense that, oh my God, this is the 10th Hunger Games. Like, wow. Like, I mean, I absolutely was just like, wow, this is some amazing content right here. Like, even like in a sense that it's very equal to that of Catching Fire. But it's after the 10th Hunger Games when it ends, right? So the end of the second act where things kind of dip a little bit. Because I remember my reaction reading this book, where after I finished reading the 10th Hunger Games, I'm like, oh my God, wow, this is such amazing content. This is such a really intense Hunger Games. But why do we still have another 120 pages left with this book? And that's how I felt. I was like, why do we still have a lot of content to cover? And it definitely feels a bit overwhelming when you start to really go beyond the 10th Hunger Games content, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that do happen where you're just like immediately like, oh my God, this is, I did not expect this, right? I mean, some, big twists and turns. But, once we go beyond that, right, there are definitely areas where, like, when we start to see a bit more of Coriolanus's story and where it goes forward, it does take a little bit of a dip in terms of interest. It starts to get a little bit boring and bland in terms of like what's going on in the moment. It takes a while to really pick up the pieces until it eventually starts to really pick up. So like, if you were like me who did continue the books, you'll know that eventually things do pick up beyond, the things that we see with peacekeepers and all that sort of stuff. And eventually when we do get to the end, it's when you're kind of like another big shocking moment, right? But it does take a little bit of time to kind of jump back into your intrigue of the actual storytelling and the character arcs and what's going on with Coriolanus's journey moving forward beyond the 10th Hunger Games. So I'm very curious how Francis Lawrence and other filmmakers involved in this were able to tackle that third act right there, because I feel like that's the one that's a much more of a wiggly room right there, where they can play around with the actual length and, make some changes here and there, but also how they can still, be very faithful to actual content from the prequel. And again, it's a very tough one. It's a very tough one that really kind of takes a while to kind of jump back into, which I expect a lot of people are going to be a bit overwhelmed about. I feel it's going to be very overwhelming, not underwhelming, very overwhelming. So again, that's one I feel like I'm going to be a bit concerned about. I hope at the end of the day that, it works out, that maybe, Lawrence has some, magic trick on his hands to maybe not fix it, but just to kind of rearrange the structure of that third act right there. Because again, the third act is the one I'm just kind of struggling a little bit of how they're going to be able to play this out in the movie. But yeah, that's something that I wanted to mention, the third act. That's something to kind of keep an eye on, that, I'll be curious to see how they play that off in the movie. But yeah, I think that basically just about sums up my questions and concerns about this movie. I think I've addressed all the things I need to say. So let's get right down next into the next topic, which is, of course, box office. Because again, I feel like when it comes to box office, there's been a lot of discussion about it, at least especially from people who have been following with the Hunger Games for quite some time now. And I want to address a little bit of the actual box office, because I feel like some people have really taken out of proportion in terms of its box office projections as well as its possibilities of success. So the reason why I want to talk about box office particularly for this one is because, as I said before, I've noticed a lot of people who have been talking about box office have been already giving off this doomsday narrative, how this movie is going to be a complete flop, it's going to be a complete disaster, yada yada. And for someone like me who is at least a bit more aware, it has a bit more of an understanding of how box office works and how you can declare a movie of success, right? Hearing those, like, doomsday storylines, I'm just kind of like, that's not the whole story. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, you're already giving a doomsday narrative even before the movie has even come out. So with that being the case, I want to break down a little bit of the box office compared to some of the other movies. So let me just get right down into the actual chart that I made, similar to what I did with Marvels. But let's get right down into the chart for it. 3, 2, 1. So here is the chart that I made for the Hunger Games franchise. You can see I used the inspiration of the Hunger Games colors to make this chart, so I hope you appreciate my creativity here. But here's a chart for it to kind of break down the box office when it comes to the Hunger Games franchise. So like I did with the Marvels movie, I broke it down into budget, opening weekend domestic, final box office, break even, and profit. So instantly, let's just kind of summarize a little bit. Instantly, you can tell that the most profitable, the highest grossing Hunger Games movie, of course, is Catching Fire. That one made about $865 million in its final box office count, and it made about a profit of about $585 million, more or less. And it makes sense why, because at least when it comes to the actual trilogy, the best book was Catching Fire. I mean, there's a reason why for it. I just explained it a little earlier ago. It's the violence, the stakes, how it really takes a big turn. There's a plot twist. Great stuff. Love that book. It has some really great structure, some really great storytelling. It makes sense why this movie is not only the best Hunger Games books in the actual series, but it's also one of the most profitable Hunger Games movies when it comes to actual movie franchise. So that makes sense right there. Of course, the lowest grossing Hunger Games movie is Mockingjay Part 2. And again, we're not taking into account Ballads right now, but Mockingjay Part 2 is the lowest grossing Hunger Games movie. And this movie actually made about $160 million when it comes to its budget, far more than Catching Fire. And even with its, the fact that it made less in terms of its opening weekend domestic, as well as the fact that its profit is even less than, the other Hunger Games movies, it still made a profit. It made a lot of money. It made about $333 million. So it made far more than its break-even point. Therefore, it is a success. So let's talk about the projections of Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and what this means for the prequel. So right now, the projections are showing that this movie is going to make about $38 to $50 million when it comes to its opening weekend domestic number. That's the projection right now. Now, when you compare it to the other Hunger Games installments, right? So let's look at the 50 million range, so the higher range. When you compare it to the other Hunger Games movies, right, it only makes about half of Mockingjay Part 2. And Mockingjay Part 2 is the lowest grossing Hunger Games movie, so that needs to be noted. And it's only going to make about a third of what the first Hunger Games movie made, and a third of what Catching Fire made. So it's not looking great. I mean, $38 to $50 million compared to other, Hunger Games movies that made about more than $100 million. Like, that's such a low ball. And it's very concerning when you look at the numbers instantly, right? Like, when you look at the numbers right there, you're just like, oh my God, this movie's going to flop. This is where we're hearing a lot of this narrative about how this movie is going to be a failure, going to be a box office bomb, because of the fact that the movie's not even going to make anywhere near what the other movies had made when it comes to its opening weekend domestic numbers. But what a lot of those people are not taking consideration is the actual budget and what its break-even point is looking to be. This is what's far more important, and that's what we need to focus on. So let's look at the budget for Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So the budget for this film is roughly around $100 million. When you compare that to the other Hunger Games movies, it's actually the second, it's a second least expensive Hunger Games movie, just ahead of Hunger Games, right? So it's even less expensive than Catching Fire, less expensive than Mockingjay Part 1, and less expensive than Mockingjay Part 2. Way less expensive than that. So it actually has a very doable budget. It has a far more doable production budget that makes it easier to make up, its break-even point and even make a profit. So its break-even point for the movie is around $200 million. Okay. So not too bad, not too shabby, a lot better than the high expectations that Mockingjay and Catching Fire had to deal with. So a lot more doable in that sense. So because of the fact that the budget is far more lower than the other movies, this movie actually has a much better chance of actually performing very well in the box office and becoming a success. Maybe not in the scale that the other Hunger Games movies have made, probably not. Definitely nowhere near Catching Fire or Hunger Games, but it'll make some money. It will probably see the light of day, these profits. And so I added in the international projections, of course, because I think that is very, very, important in this case, in this assessment, because in terms of its international projections for its opening weekend, apparently it's going to be making around $90 to $142 million. So that's saying a lot. So if it does make up the lower end of that range, that's about almost making about 90% of its budget back. That's great. Not a big deal. Okay. It's a really good progress right there. If it makes about 142 million, the higher end of it, that's very good, because that's already making more than its budget, and it's getting close to its break-even point. And one of the things that we have to address is that, with this being the opening weekend, right, we also have to look at the second weekend. And one of the things that the Ballad of Songbirds is going to have the advantage of is the fact that there's going to be Thanksgiving. A lot of people love to go to movies during this time. I don't believe there's going to be any big movies coming out around Thanksgiving weekend. And of course, there's a lot of things that are going on with the Marvel. So with that being the case, Ballads actually has a good chance of doing very well its second week, where it can make up its break-even point. Again, that's if it makes up the higher end of the range. But yeah, having seen these projections, right, even though the fact that, it's making a lot less than the other Hunger Games movies, that is not to say that this movie's going to be a failure, this movie's going to be a flop. Right now, the projections are making it so that it's going to be doing pretty well, especially because of the fact that, again, it's been 8 years in between the last Hunger Games movies and this movie, right? And the fact that it's still going to be performing pretty well and it's going to be making a lot of money, I mean, these are good numbers. So I think that overall, with Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, despite what everyone has been saying about it and how it's going to be a box office bomb, flop, that's not necessarily the case. It still has a pretty doable budget that it can make up for and still make that break-even point, and even beyond that to make the profit. So, but that's not to say that that's going to be the case, of course. I mean, these are just projections. Anything could happen. We saw what happened with Marvel's last week, where the projections were looking like 50 to 80 million, and that was just being generous. And the actual box office numbers were only about 47 million. So it was actually an overestimation of the projection. So it could still be the case here, where even Ballad's tracking numbers are going to be a bit overestimated. So if that's the case, yeah, it's going to be a bit worrisome. But even with that being the case, I think that when it comes to Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, I think it still has a pretty good chance of doing pretty well at the box office. So I hope that clarifies a lot more of what the actual box office is looking like. Again, a lot of people I know a lot of people who have been talking about this movie who are a bit more, knowledgeable about the Hunger Games and have been following on with the actual Hunger Games franchise. I mean, I hope this clarifies that, a lot of what they're saying is kind of a lot of BS, because I'm looking at it and I'm just like, well, this movie actually has a much better chance of making a profit than some of the other movies that have gone all this year, and which I'll address in a second. But yeah, I hope that clarifies a lot of things. I hope that really opens up a lot of perspective, and seeing that, oh, this movie actually has a really good chance of making a profit and becoming a success. Not in the way that the other movies have done, but still doing the way that, again, for a post Hunger Games movie that's, taking place 8 years later, that, it's still going to do well. So having now mentioned this, let's kind of talk a little bit about the factors, right? So let's get right down into that. So let's address why, even though the fact that I just mentioned where the movie itself is going to be doing pretty well regardless of the range of its actual projections for the domestic weekend. And again, even the fact that it is going to make a lot less than the other movies, it's still going to be making a profit because of the fact that its budget is much lower. Let's talk about why, this movie is still going to be trending towards becoming the lowest grossing Hunger Games movies ever, right? And so let's get right down into it. The first factor is that, again, as I mentioned before, we have an 8-year gap in between the Hunger Games movies. Now, when we look at the actual, original Hunger Games movies that came out, I mean, the actual movies themselves came out every year. So we had Hunger Games on 2012, Catching Fire 2013, Mockingjay Part 1 in 2014, and Mockingjay Part 2 2015. I think the longest gap we had in between movie was actually the first two movies, because Hunger Games came out March of 2012, and then the following movie came out November of 2013, and then since then there's been this trend of this November release date. So that's the longest gap before. Now the longest gap would be between Mockingjay Part 2 and this movie. And so it makes a lot more sense why, right? This movie is not making the exact numbers that the original Hunger Games made. There's this 8-year gap. It's been a long time since we've had, new books, let alone new movies. And so a lot of the audience for the film may have kind of, moved forward, or maybe probably not aware of the actual movie itself coming out, or the fact that there's another Hunger Games movies coming out. I mean, a lot of people who are aware of it are going to be the ones who have read the books and been following with the franchise, like me. So it makes a lot more sense where, because of this gap, that, you know, it's going to take some time to kind of let a lot of people be aware that, oh, by the way, this Hunger Games movie is coming out this week. You should probably check it out. So that's one reason why there's a long gap between the original Hunger Games and this prequel. Second is that, you know, just looking at the overall trend with box office in general, I mean, Hunger Games Ballad of Songbirds is not the only film that's been dealing with these, you know, box office projections and these box office numbers that are just a bit underwhelming. I mean, we've been seeing all year long that a lot of movies are just not making the numbers that they should be making. We've seen this with Fast X. We've seen this with Mission Impossible, Dead Reckoning Part 1. We've seen this with Indiana Jones Part 5, or Indiana Jones 5, and so on and so forth. I think the only movies that really kind of exceeded expectations were Barbie, Oppenheimer, and a few other ones like Five Nights at Freddy's and Megan. But we've seen, generally speaking, when it comes to franchises, a lot of movies have not been meeting, you know, the box office expectations. Why is that? There's a couple factors to it. One could be because of the fact that a lot of the movies that are coming out right now have some really inflated production budgets. They're very costly. So it makes the break-even point a lot more higher than there should be because of those inflated box office, because of those inflated budgets. And so the profits are going to be a lot more smaller than they should be, even though these films should be doing a lot better. Okay, that's one way. The second reason, of course, is that we're right now in this really huge rabbit hole between theoretical versus streaming, you know, experiences. I mean, this has been a pretty big discussion about, you know, what's been going on with the whole, you know, the streaming, the streaming culture and phenomena, and how streaming has really kind of become this really big thing, especially since, you know, COVID, because COVID, you know, the only way to really go and watch the latest movies was to see it through streaming. So because of this whole, you know, this whole new kind of experience of watching movies and streaming, that it's definitely kind of changed a lot of this whole structure of how you watch a movie. Now, a lot of times before, you know, COVID, right? A lot of movies don't come into, you know, VOD until like maybe 3-4 months after movies release. Nowadays, a lot of times when it comes to streaming, movies don't, you know, the movies that do end up in theaters, you know, that were in theaters end up in streaming about a month or so after its theater release. So the actual window between streaming and theater, you know, releases have now shortened a lot comparison to how it was before the actual pandemic. And because of that, you know, a lot of people are just like, you know, if this movie's gonna be ready in streaming, like, why do I have to go to the theater? I could just wait and watch it at home. That's how my dad says it. So yeah, because of how, you know, trajectory of how people view movies have changed since the pandemic, that, you know, a lot of people are just kind of like waiting, you know, just for a movie to kind of release in streaming, because they can just wait a little longer, like, you know, a month or so, and then eventually, you know, be available on streaming or video on demand. So that's been the case right here. We've been seeing that kind of having an effect with a lot of movies in the last few months. And so that could probably be playing a case here as well, where people may not necessarily watch the movie right away. Like, again, if this movie's going to be coming out in about a month or so after it's released, then they can just wait a little bit. So that's one reason why, again, we've been seeing this trend with, you know, a lot of big movies just not meeting the box office expectations. And that's probably the case here, where they're feeling a little bit of those effects. So that's another reason. A third reason I have to say is the marketing. I think the marketing for this film has been a bit lackluster. And again, this would be a bit on the fault of Lionsgate. Now, there's a couple reasons why this could be the case. So for one thing, we had the strikes. The strikes really took over this whole summer. So that probably played a big role on why, you know, a lot of studios, and not just, you know, Lionsgate, but a lot of studios haven't been able to market their movies in ways that they should be able to. And that probably played a big role here as well with Ballad of Songbirds and Snake, because otherwise, like, you know, Lionsgate should be able to kind of play off from the success of the previous Hunger Games to really talk about, you know, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, but they haven't really done that. Now, of course, having now said that, right, even though the marketing has been a bit lackluster, when it comes to actual movie itself and promotion, Ballad Ballad of Songbirds is actually one of the few, exceptions where they actually had the cast manage to actually talk about the movie. So Lionsgate was able to get interim agreement with SAG to allow their actors to actually promote the movie. So they've actually been promoting the movie the last week or so. So that's Tom Blyth, Richard Zegler, Hunter Schafer. They've all been talking about the movie. So they've actually had the chance to actually talk about it. I think they just had their premiere just a couple days ago or just tonight. So they do have a bit of that advantage where they are able to talk about the movie and hype it up a little bit. So maybe the numbers will improve because of that, or maybe it will actually help make it stand in its actual projection or its actual trajectory right now. But yeah, the marketing has been a bit, poor recently with this film, but it has picked up a little bit in the last week or so. But yeah, that's one reason why the marketing could have been better. It could have actually improved even beyond this, could have actually at least played off on the Hunger Games fame, and didn't really kind of do that. But that's one reason why I think the marketing has just been a bit, lackluster in the last few weeks. And lastly, the last reason why I think this movie had some lower projections might be a little bit accredited to Richard Zegler in not the greatest way possible. So if you've been following up on the movie sphere or the, just in general, like what's been going on with Richard Zegler, you will know that she has been on the limelight recently about her comments about Snow White, her comments about the original 1938 version, and those comments have recirculated online to the point where a lot of people have been critical about her comments about the 1938 version. Now, hasn't been taken out of proportion, just a little slightly. And a lot of people are just, not really a big fan of Rachel Zegler. So people have been pretty critical about her, and therefore there is a chance there are some crowds out there who are a bit dissuaded from seeing this movie because of Zegler, which, I mean, okay, whatever. But I don't think it's going to have too much of a profound effect on it. I think there's going to be some effect where there's going to be some few, thousands of people who probably won't see it because of how much they dislike Rachel Zegler. But even with that being the case, like with the fact that, with Rachel Zegler being one of the two protagonists in this movie, and how there is a bit of this sort of energy right now towards Rachel Zegler and how people feel about her, that I think that it's not going to have too much of a profound effect on the actual budget or the actual box office, but I think it does play a little bit of a factor of why this movie is going to have a much lower box office than you would usually expect with the Hunger Games movies. So Again, if you know about this is what's been going on. Again, that's not to even say that, the actual Snow White movie has been dealing with other controversy. The actual controversy itself has just been pretty massive, in just terms of what's been going on behind the scenes and what's just been the decision about it. So Rachel Zegler's comments just only kind of tip of the iceberg of it, but even that being the case, her comments have definitely kind of soured a lot of people about their feelings about her. So yeah, that's just one thing to kind of comment about. Again, I think it's not gonna be too profound, but just a possible factor into playing into its box office. So now that's how much. So that basically wraps about what I have to say about box office right there. I think I have summarized everything that I need to say about it. Again, I don't think it's gonna be a failure that a lot of people are, describing it to be. I think it's gonna do fine, as long as it, it's on track and it does well the following week as well. But yeah, having now addressed the box office, let's get right down to the final bit, and that is to talk about the first reviews. So here's what I'm going to do is that I'm going to read off some of the reviews that have come out for the movie, the first reactions for it, and then we'll actually look at the Rotten Tomatoes scores. So let's get right down into those bits. So here are the first reactions for the Hunger Games, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So the first one I'm going to read is from Daniel Huet. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is the best Hunger Games movie yet. It's darker, more of a character study than anything, but always genuinely entertaining. With high stakes, solid action, killer performances, it's a thrilling return to Pan Am. Not surprised right there. The fact that it's going to be darker, I expect that to be the case because, as I said before, it does take some really deep, dark turns in terms of where the narrative goes, in terms of, again, Snow's story and his rise to becoming this eventual President Snow. Character study, again, makes a lot more sense because it is very focused on Snow and how he eventually becomes this really merciless, very power-hungry person. Killer performances, I'm not surprised about this because when you have a cast like Viola Davis and Peter Dinklage as part of your cast, I feel like the masterclass of performances are going to be quite immense. Again, that's one of the things I've actually mentioned in some of my reaction videos for the trailers, that the actual cast looks absolutely amazing in terms of performances. Viola Davis looks like amazing as Dr. Volumnia Gold. I mean, she's nailing it out of the park as playing this sort of evil scientist vibe. Love it. I feel like that's probably one case. Another one is going to be Peter Dinklage playing Dean Casca Highbottom, who is the, the dean of the academy, as well as someone who has this fit against Snow. And he's gonna be quite a complex character. I can't wait to see him and how he plays out his character too. Not like in the way that Tyrion Lannister is, but definitely one that's gonna be like, whoa, like it's gonna take some really deep turns. So not surprised about the killer performances. I cannot wait to see this. I cannot wait to see Viola Davis as Dr. William McGill. I'm so excited to see that. But again, not surprised about this comment right here. Stephanie Ramirez, longtime Hunger Games fans can rest easy knowing that the Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, has landed on top. It definitely shows how much they wanted to stay true to the source material of the books, and this has become one of my favorite Hunger Games films to date. Love that. That's very promising. The fact that it is very in tune with the story is really promising. That means that it's going to be keeping up a lot of the plot devices. Again, I wonder if that means that the ending's going to be the same. The fact that she is saying that it's one of her favorite Hunger Games movies today, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I'll see it for myself and see where I will rank it. I feel like it's going to at least be better than Mockingjay for sure. And I'm talking about both Mockingjay parts. I feel like it's going to be at least better than both Mockingjay movies. Whether it be better than Hunger Games or even better than Catching Fire, I would have to see it for myself. But yeah, again, another big positive review right here that's really showing, again, the fact that this movie really goes deep into the book, the actual source material, and really going to this dark vibe of it. So that's from Lauren Lamingo. The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is an epic return to the world of Pandam. The production design and world building are excellent. With a bare bones capital and games still finding their identity, the stakes are raised and immensely felt. Fans of the book will be happy. Love that. Again, the production of this film is incredible. I will have to say that. Just from the trailers itself, you can tell the production for this film has really gone up. I think it's a lot better than even the original Hunger Games movies. And that's saying a lot. I feel like that's saying a lot. And that's coming from the fact that the budget for the movie is even less than the last 3 Hunger Games movies. So the fact that the production and the world building is very fantastic, I'm not really surprised about. I feel like it definitely gives off this really old vibe of like post-war, World War II. And I think that I've read somewhere where that's where they got a lot of their inspiration. So it makes a lot more sense there. But yeah, not surprised about the production. The fact that a lot of book readers are going to be happy, which means, okay, I'm very excited to see this. So yeah, very another positive side to this. Okay, so here's one from Josh Horowitz, a really well-known guy in the movie sphere. So as someone who has covered the Hunger Games films very closely, I'm thrilled to report Ballad Songbirds and Snakes delivers big time, and it might be my favorite of all time. In fact, Tom Blyth is a star, Rachel Zegler is fantastic, Dinklage nearly steals the film, it's epic. Again, it really emphasizes the performances here. The fact that he's also saying it's his favorite, I mean, I'm very curious to see if it's gonna be my favorite too. Tom Blyth, Rachel, the fact that they're really emphasizing the performances is a big thing. The fact that they're even mentioning Dinklage here, I wonder if they're gonna elevate his character a little bit, because we only see him like in bits and pieces in the beginning. We see Dinklage's bits in the beginning at the end, so he's not a lot in the middle of the movie, or at least not that I remember of. But I'm very curious to see that. But it's epic. I love that. So another positive review right there. I really Tessa Smith, Mama's Geeky. The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, that perfectly delivers the downward spiral of who will become President Coriolanus Snow that fans love to hate. The cast is phenomenal. Tom Blyth gives the performance of a lifetime. Not surprised right there. Again, we're seeing a lot of common trends about performances in Tom Blyth and the production. Okay, Eric Goldman. So here's one that's a bit more in the mix. So The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is very good. The depiction of the game is terrific and really captures a scaled down and arguably more intensely brutal version of what we see in the future. However, don't think the ending captures the impact the book did. Okay, that one I'm a bit concerned about. And again, this is just one of the few reviews that I've seen that's a bit more mixed. Trending a little bit on the positive, of course, as I said before. The middle parts with the actual games itself, I expect it's going to be far more brutal than the actual movies that we've got with the original ones with Katniss Everdeen. That one's also really highlighted here. The fact that they mentioned that the ending is not as, as impactful as a book, again, this is the one I was mentioning how I'm a bit concerned about. So I wonder what they mean by that. But yeah, again, mostly in the positive side, but there is that one, negative bit that I was trying to find. So if that's the case about the ending, then yeah, I have every right to be concerned about what's gonna happen. Okay, Rema's screen says The Hunger Games about Songbirds and Snake was more gripping than the original, suspenseful and gritty, especially in the tribute fights. Runtime could have been trimmed down and ending could have been less ambiguous, but I liked it. Okay, so positives we see is the grittiness and the suspense. Not surprised. Runtime could have been trimmed down. I wonder, again, this is the one I was mentioning was going to be a bit more of my concern is the runtime as well as the lengthiness. And that's more so because of the fact that it's because of the book itself is very long. And the ending could have been less ambiguous. I think that I'm assuming that this is regarding about Lucy's fate. So if that's the case, it seems as though they're going to be sticking to the book. And so if that's the case, that's great. We're not going to get, any too much of a big change about that. But yeah, I mean, if that's the case with this, I'm not really surprised about it. This is exactly how the book itself felt. And so the runtime, again, not really surprised. Even the books felt really long and the ending was also pretty ambiguous. So not surprised about that. That's coming directly not just for the movie, but from the prequel itself. A couple more. The Hunger Games about Songbirds and Snakes and the overall triumph, expanding on the incredible world building that is the franchise is famous for. Tom Blyth and Rachel Zegler are great leads with very dynamic performances, and Viola Davis steals the scene in a very delicious villainous role. The film reflects a dark and gritty tone similar to its Mockingjay predecessors, with several frightening and intense scenes throughout. Its commentary on classism, war, and political propaganda also remains just as powerful as it was a decade ago in the first movie. Very positive, again, very highlighting the world building, the grittiness, performances. Viola Davis as the villain. I mean, I'm so excited to see her as Dr. Volumnia Gold. Not surprised about that. The grittiness. I mean, it seems pretty on point with everyone saying about this movie that this is a much darker take on the actual movie in comparison to what we saw with the Katniss Everdeen version. So let's see. So let's read Barry Hertz. The Hunger Games about Songbirds and Snakes. Sorry that Francis Lawrence regretted splitting Mockingjay in two, but he should have done same with prequel. Thrillingly vicious first two half of the movie, upended by rushed, unsteady final act, Revenge of the Sith comparisons, inescapable. Okay, this one is a bit more mixed. Definitely can see where it's trending a little bit more towards the negative side. I think this is the one that's the most negative I've seen so far. So the fact that he's saying they should have been split, I mean, I would disagree with that. I think it's fine with the way it is, but I can understand why the third part would have been rushed and unsteady final act. This is the part that I'm very, very concerned about myself, as I said before. The third part is the one I'm very curious about how they tackle that. Are they going to tackle in a similar way the books does, or they're going to cut up some scenes here and there? I wonder what it is. The fact that they call it the Revenge of the Sith comparison of Escapable, that's a very interesting comparison, but I could see why. Because like Anakin, how he eventually becomes Darth Vader, and then here it's like Snow becomes, President Snow and that ruthless, power hungry tyrant. It's like, okay, that makes a lot more sense. But the third act, I think that's the one I have to highlight, is that the third act and the fact that it's unsteady and rushed, a bit concerning, but I'm not really surprised. I felt like a little bit of, again, the third act for me was a bit of a tough one to read through when I read the actual books. So I wonder where they may have, cut up some scenes, but I'll see for myself. But again, not surprised about the third act, right? Last two bits. This is from Eric Davis. Really love the new Hunger Games movie, right up there with Catching Fire in terms of the best of the entire series. Solid story, dug the twist, great action sequences, the character development and world expansion, but the real star is the cast. They crush it. Rachel Zegler truly shines in her character. Lucy Gray is very different from Katniss, and the intense, twisty dynamics between Lucy and Tom Blyth's Coriolanus are a treat to watch. Viola Davis and Peter Dinklage are powerhouses and widely compelling as they are. Davis's character in particular is so devious and so marvelous to watch. I didn't know what to expect from Ballad of Songbirds and Snake, but shout out to all involved. This is great, entertaining watch that works for both longtime fans of the Hunger Games and people who are brand new to the franchise. Is definitely a recommend from me. Really positive. Again, same sort of sentiments that we've been reading a little bit earlier. The action sequences, the character developments, the performances from the cast. Again, not really surprised right there. Even I'm excited to see how this all plays out. So And then finally from Scott Mendelson, the new Hunger Games is pretty great, superbly constructed and exquisitely acted. It wrestles with the franchise's complicated pop culture legacy while thriving as a money's on-screen IMAX blockbuster. Zegler gives a full-on movie star turn, and Davis is a macabre hoot. That's hilarious, a macabre hoot. Again, very positive. Nothing more to say about how this movie really works out. The performances seems to be kind of the standout here. The backdrop, the world building, those seems to be the standout. What seems to kind of be more of the cons of this movie is going to be, of course, that third act, which I myself am a bit concerned about, that third act, as well as the ending. So not really surprised about that, because those are the things that even I'm a bit, curious to see how and whether they are able to resolve those issues from the book. So now, having read all those first reviews, let's look at the Rotten Tomatoes score. So again, the embargo for this movie has lifted since last week. So that's a good sign, at least, that this movie's not going to be a complete bust. And so right now, in terms of what we see on Rotten Tomatoes right now, it is currently at 66% with 50 reviews. I mean, that's kind of like a D+ range, so it's all right. As of right now, this would make it the lowest rated Hunger Games movie in the whole franchise. But again, this could really change, because I think even the lowest rated Hunger Games right now is Mockingjay Part 2. I think both of them are right around the same. I think 70%. So this could change. I mean, overnight when more reviews come out. But right now it's at 66% with 50 reviews. I think it's not too bad. But I mean, a lot of them are comparing to Catching Fire, which is actually the highest rated Hunger Games right there. So I'll see if this actually changes. But that's right now the Rotten Tomatoes scores for this movie. So overall, we read the reviews, how they are based on the positive side. This is trending on the positive side. The Rotten Tomatoes score is showing that most people agree that overall that the movie is good. There is about maybe 34% who are just like, not really, but we'll see how it all goes. Again, I cannot wait to see this movie myself, of course, and see again kind of what I can address. But that basically, explains a lot of the reviews and things that we've broken down. So that's just about it right there. So that is all I have to say about it. I think I've addressed all the big things that we need to talk about leading up to the movie's release. We're just about a couple days away from seeing Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I talked about my expectations. I talked about the box office, as well as the first reviews and Rotten Tomatoes score. So yeah, I cannot wait to see this movie and see for myself and what I feel about it, where I feel like this is going to rank in terms of Hunger Game movie adaptations, and whether or not I will like it for myself. As I said before, I think there are areas where I know for a fact this movie is going to be really great. I mean, the trailers look really promising. The performances look really great. I mean, just from reading the trailers, I mean, it's a really promising sign that this movie is going to be very immense in terms of its production and quality and performances. But again, a big question is going to be, of course, is whether that third act is not going to be as bad as a lot of people are seeming it to kind of describe it to be. But even that being the case, I cannot wait to see this movie. I will be seeing it this Thursday, and hopefully I'll be able to give off my reaction and my review for it. I don't know if I'll have it out immediately because I'm going to be out of town that weekend, but out of town after having seen the movie, but I hope to have that up as soon as possible once I've seen the film. But so that basically wraps up my whole discussion about the Hunger Games, the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So I cannot wait to see this movie this Thursday. But what are your thoughts about the movie, having now kind of talked about more of this? If you're someone who has read the books, what are your expectations for this movie? Are you just as concerned about that third act and ending as I am? Or do you have some other bits that you're a bit more concerned about? If you're someone who has not read the books but have watched the movies, what are your thoughts about watching this new prequel? Are you excited to see it now, having now read the reviews, or are you still a bit more skeptical about it? If you have seen the movies, the other Hunger Games movies, where do you rank them? For me, it's going to be Catching Fire, Hunger Games, Part 2, and then Part 1. That's just me. But let me know what your thoughts are about that. What are some other things that you're looking forward to seeing when it comes to seeing this movie? Do you think that there's actually a possibility that there's going to be more books beyond just this one that we have? Or are there other ways that we're going to see more of Suzanne Collins kind of explore her universe, and that is the Hunger Games? And let me know if you have any other thoughts about some of the things that we discussed here, or if you just want to give some other comments about the Hunger Games franchise. Let me know in the thoughts below, and make sure to like and subscribe.